As a small island developing state, Fiji is one of the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Yet, Fiji has in many ways demonstrated leadership in international climate action by being the first country to ratify the Paris Agreement and adopting ambitious targets in its first nationally determined contribution, NDC, under the Paris Agreement, and was among the first countries and the first SIDS to develop an NDC implementation roadmap. Fiji is submitting this long-term low-emission development strategy.
The Fiji Low Emission Development Strategy 2018 to 2050 is a living document compiled to define pathways to achieve low emission development in Fiji until 2050. The Low Emission Development Strategy enhances the Fijian government's ability to plan for decarbonization of the economy in the long term. It also provides a framework and a pathway for progressive revision and enhancement of targets under its nationally determined contributions.
The consultations were to address the development of Fiji's 2015 vision for low-emission development in each sector, scenario development in each sector, including business as usual, high ambition and very high ambition mitigation scenarios, and validation of findings for each sector.
For Fiji, the low emission development strategy is actually very much aligned to the 5-year and the 20-year national development plan for the Fijian government, which also calls for a deep decarbonization and the achievement of the net zero by 2050. And because if we're looking at enhancing our NDCs stand for nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So if we are to revise and submit to the UN enhanced NDCs, I think it's critical that countries undertake a long-term emissions reduction planning, because this then helps countries to understand what their emission sources are, and really based on the long-term planning they can then sort of move in an incremental manner in terms of what they can mitigate, and of course map onto the cycles of the Paris Agreement.
The low-emission development strategy is primarily focused on mitigation rather than adaptation, which is the primary focus of Fiji's National Adaptation Plan. The LEDS focuses on 7 key sectors as well as cross-cutting issues covering the whole of Fiji's economy.
For the Fijian Low Emission Development Strategy, we have in fact taken a whole of economy approach, which essentially means that we've looked at various sectors of the Fijian economy and how they can contribute towards decarbonization. For example, we have looked at the energy sector, which of course looks at renewable energy side of things, and of course transportation, which includes land, maritime, and air transportation. And of course we also have the AFOLU sector, which stands for agriculture, forestry and other land use sector, which of course has a lot of mitigation potential. We've also looked at the mitigation potential of the waste sector in the LEDS analysis, and finally the sector which is quite unique to the Fijian LEDS analysis is the inclusion of the coastal wetlands.
The greenhouse gas emissions is in the land transport sector it's a great contributor. It's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the land transport sector. We all know that, and I guess until recently there hasn't been much emphasis or focus on the reduction part, especially when we're talking about the South Pacific region. In my view, transforming to a low or zero emission transportation in the Pacific can be done. It can be expedited. Pacific countries are ideally placed and can accelerate adoption of cleaner transportation. So technology is fast changing and we cannot escape that. We need to act now, and we need to align ourselves to these developments if we are to ensure that our emission goals are met.
Waste sector contributes 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in Fiji. Our largest emission sector is the energy sector. So with the implementation of NDC roadmap, where we're going to go heavy on renewable energy, so the emissions from the energy sector would actually decrease. And then in future, if you don't do anything about the waste sector, then the emissions from the waste sector is bound to increase further. So it will contribute sizable portion of our greenhouse gas inventory. Now, in a very high ambition scenario, even like considering diversion of waste, considering recycling of paper and plastics, and considering the waste to energy option at Katowice, it only reduces methane emissions by 70% by 2050, as compared to the business as usual scenario. So if we are really aiming for a deep decarbonization in the waste sector, we need to also consider waste to energy in the solid waste disposal sector.
It gives the direction to government ministries, agencies, and also, of course, the private sector and civil society as well, as to where they should start doing their own planning, putting in place the right policies for low carbon development, and also what technology should be introduced, as well as what skills they need to have. You need to plan for new skills in the sectors.
Achieving Fiji's very high ambition scenario will be challenging, but it is possible with the establishment of a comprehensive enabling environment, sufficient access to technology and climate financing, extensive capacity building and education programs.
The overall impact of the project is that Fiji will continue to take the lead in setting a pathway to a low-carbon future and contribute to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and keeping 1.5 alive.